everybody. Ron Wildman in here again on Middle Georgia Spotlight, and it's shining on Dr. Chris Grant, the head of the Mercer University Political Science Department, and this is the appropriate program for it this time of year. We're down to it, Doctor.
Yep. This time next week, I think we might know.
Then again, we might not.
We might not, but my hunch is that we're going to have a pretty good idea of the outcome of the election by 5 o'clock on Wednesday morning. We may not have certified results yet, but we'll have enough that we have a good sense of where it's all going. Could be wrong, been wrong before, but that's my hunch.
What are you telling the students over there at Mercer? What's different about this 2020 election?
I think this election in many ways is going to be a referendum on President Trump's first term in office, if there is a first term or a second term. I think that he's challenged in some ways that presidents haven't been challenged before. The COVID-19 has been a cataclysmic event in the country, and it's affected everyone in some ways or others. He has people that think he's done an excellent job, and he has some people that think he's done a horrible job. But it has focused a lot of attention on his performance. It's an election where we'll elect lots of different offices. The Senate is certainly in the balance of this election.
I wanted to ask you specifically, Georgia has a chance to be in the crosshairs of the entire nation if it could be 49-49, and then we got these two Senate races, which is very rare in one state at one time, and they could be runoffs.
Both of them could be.
And it was January 5th's runoff date, so between November and January,
that's right, we're
going to have a lot of fun down here.
Well, and we may be the political spotlight of the country, because it could be that the Senate, the outcome in these two special elections would be the balance of the Senate. In the Johnny Isakson retired, Kelly Loeffler appointed seat, there's almost no way to see an outcome that doesn't involve a runoff. With each poll that I've seen with Ossoff coming up and being tied with Perdue, that also would likely lead to a runoff, because in Georgia we have the majority rule. You don't get to get elected with a plurality, you got to have a majority. We're the only state that requires a runoff election for it. Maine actually has a ranked choice voting process, but the only two states in the country that do that. So Georgia could be the center of all attention with two Senate seats in runoffs.
And we'll double back on all this we're talking about right now, but we also have a hot sheriff's race here in Bibb County.
Yeah, surprisingly hot. Bibb County's not been known for very contentious partisan races at the local level. This one has turned out to be a bit more contentious than I would have predicted.
And of course, we have the legislative races and Senate races in the House and Senate in Georgia. So the presidential race supersedes everything in everybody's mind.
Eats up a lot of our attention and our thoughts. May be consequential to people on a day-to-day basis. For the most part, the president steers big ships of government, whereas the General Assembly has more impact on our day-to-day lives. In many ways, because they deal with roads and schools and law enforcement, many more things that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, there's a lot on the ballot this year.
What do you think about this early voting, the amount of votes?
Well, I've been an early voter now, I think, since we've had it in Georgia. I like it because I don't have to stand in line. I can take care of it.
But this year you have to stand in line.
I stood in line, but I didn't have to stand in line very long. I was at North Macon Park, and I was in line for maybe 15 minutes. So I've been down to the Board of Elections office. Now, those lines have been long around the building. So it has been early voting, and people have been using the opportunity to do that. I think that I like early voting because it gives people the option of going in and doing it at a time which is most convenient for you. What's difficult about early voting for the campaigns particularly is that people start voting before the campaign is over. And so you don't get the full force of everything that the campaign is trying to do in convincing people of what outcome would be in the best interest.
You know, I heard in some states they have a change your mind
I heard that too.
Have you ever heard of that before?
I have not heard of that before. This is a new one on me. I heard that the president's been suggesting to some people that they go back and revote.
Well, of course he would.
Well, that probably is a sign the president doesn't think he was winning the early vote.
What is happening out there with the early vote? Have you reached out?
I do not have a good sense other than what I've heard on national media. In Florida, it appears that the early vote has gone more beneficially to the Republicans, as I understand it. But most other states, the Democrats seem to be leading in early votes. I don't know what's going on in Georgia. I haven't seen any exit polls that come from Georgia. The exit pollsters are taking it into account, and they're out at key precincts doing early vote exit polling, asking people on their way out of the election site how they voted. So they've got some indications.
Speaking of polls, how important are polls?
Well, polls are information. They're not absolute fact information. They're all couched in statistical probability. What I usually tell students about polling is it's imperfect information. In the absence of information, I'll take imperfect information. But it's not perfect information. If there's anything 2016 taught us, was that the intricacy of polling, and it's both a science and an art, requires a lot of knowledge, and it's hard to do accurately all the time. Although, I will say for the pollsters, the ones that get it right, they got it right in 2016 even. They showed a 10-day cycle at the end in states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan that showed a Trump surge. And so the last 10 days of that polling, they were picking up on it. And a lot of other folks were like, this is already done for. And of course, the margins in those states were so narrow anyway. So while the pollsters weren't perfect in 2016, they were more right than they were wrong in that election.
Well, supposedly you're supposed to peak. The candidate's supposed to peak on election day, which the polls can't do anything about that till after it's over with. As you said, they were finding out they were right if they would have reported that out earlier.
Right. That's absolutely
or if they could have.
So, and early voting compounds that in new ways, because people will already have voted when the candidate might or might not peak. And it appears that Biden peaked a little earlier in some of the states. I mean, the Pennsylvania race looks like it's getting tighter. Now, if folks have early voted in Pennsylvania, that may mean that Trump doesn't have those votes to go back and capture.
I've just come back from Western Pennsylvania. Spent a week up there earlier this month. It's crazy. The advertising, well, the yard, I was in Westmoreland County, which is a heavy Republican area, and it was like 10-to-1 yard signs in favor of President Trump. But elsewhere around there is a different situation, and the TV advertising very heavily in favor of Joe Biden.
And I've seen a good bit of advertising here in Georgia, too. But, I mean, Georgia's in play in this race. But Pennsylvania is probably ground zero for who's going to be the next president of the United States. I think that if President Trump isn't able to win in Pennsylvania, he doesn't have a pathway to victory.
Well, I saw the other day he even sent Mrs. Trump over there.
Yep. And so I'd say is Pennsylvania's ground zero for the Trump campaign. Biden appears to have multiple pathways, although Pennsylvania, if he doesn't win Pennsylvania, that is probably a bad sign for his campaign.
Well, since the debate and supposedly the gaffe or whatever he said about the oil industry, it has changed over there. And of course, the Trump people are capitalizing on that.
Absolutely. And the Biden folks have been trying to thread that needle for a while, where the former vice president has tried to play what I would argue is a very middle road kind of game, where he is not going after the oil companies in terms of trying to ban fossil fuels in any way. He's stated repeatedly that he is not opposed to fracking, where the environmentalists would like for him to do much more on those accounts. And certainly the oil business doesn't want him to go down either of those paths. So he's tried to thread that needle really carefully. I'm not so sure that the debate slip and saying that he was opposed to fossil fuels doesn't hurt him in the end.
Well, he's got a different situation in the party now with the backing that he has.
Yes.
He had Bernie Sanders to contend with. And then a lot of those representatives, the big four, or the little four?
Yeah, the squad. I'll just say this, the Democratic Party is very different than it was even 30 years ago when Bill Clinton was running. We used to, if we talked about the Democratic Party in the 1970s and even into the 80s, we would have talked about we would have talked about the most liberal members of Congress being Democrats, and also the most conservative members of Congress being Democrats. And that all changed in the 80s and into the 90s. And now you don't find many Democrats that are considered to be conservative at all. And you don't find many Republicans, vice versa, that are liberal. There used to be liberal Republicans. So the parties have moved ideologically quite a bit, and it certainly encompasses Joe Biden's career. Where Joe Biden once would have probably been seen as a liberal, he became a moderate pretty quickly. Because other people moved further to the left from where Joe Biden was, or other people were elected that were further left.
What was he trying to do earlier in his career as a senator? Was busing and civil rights and some of the positions he took?
Yeah, he's senator for Delaware.
Delaware has a senator.
Yeah, two of them, and
two.
yeah, it's a small state with two senators and a representative. He's a senator from Delaware. That includes Philadelphia suburbs. Biden was an anti-busing stance in the 1970s. He did not want kids to be bused across long distances to schools that were remote from where they originally were. That was the plan that we used for.
That was basically a Republican position at that time, wasn't it?
It was a Republican position for the most part.
Yeah.
But there were some Democrats that were also in favor that also didn't favor busing. What I would say is Biden favored desegregation and wanted desegregation to happen. He just wasn't a fan of mandatory busing. And we used a variety of ways to overcome segregation. I mean, we in Bibb County have used magnet schools and school zoning as a mechanism, but we didn't do long distance busing. And that's partly true in Georgia because we have such small counties that school systems themselves don't lend themselves to 30-mile bus rides, where some states were doing that as a remedy. So I think Biden was saying, I'd rather do magnet schools, I'd rather do school zoning as a mechanism for overcoming past segregation practices. Busing doesn't make sense to him personally in that day and time. Nobody's talking about busing now. We don't talk about busing because we don't do it anymore. It has largely been a thing of the past.
But they bring it up about him.
Absolutely, because it would have been an issue of maintaining a segregated school system. I would just say with Biden, it is a practice that he was opposed to. It was not that he was opposed to desegregation. I mean, there's multiple times you can look at what he was doing, and he was very much in favor of desegregation, multiple times, and in multiple practices and policies. He just didn't choose to support the remedy of busing. And by the way, the number of African Americans that didn't support the remedy of busing. A lot of folks found it to be destructive to take kids out of a community and put them on a bus, sometimes for an hour each way, and to leave neighborhood schools to waste. And a lot of people would argue that it destroyed the fibers of public schools in the United States because the parents that could get their kids out of the public school system did. And of course, in the 70s, that would have been whites getting out of the public school system. But as we get into the 90s and beyond, it begins to be anybody who can get the kids out of the public school system, anybody that has the economic means to do so. And so the issue changes a lot over time. And busing may have been the stimulus for the exiting of well-to-do families from public schools in many cases. Not all, but many.
I found out today everybody's bused, but most people, mom and dad takes them to school.
Oh yes, I do school runs, been doing them for years, yep.
But they could ride the bus.
Yep, they could, they don't.
Oh, ride that bus. The Supreme Court position, how's that playing in this election?
I think the Supreme Court works really well. I was saying to someone today, I think we think of the United States as being a 50/50 country. And really, we're a 30/40/30 country. Our political parties are grounded in the 230s. And so for folks that are vehemently positioned about an issue that is a Supreme Court issue, it's an important issue. And the president has delivered on putting conservative jurists on the benches.
3 of them.
And on the high court, 3. Yeah, yep. So the president has certainly delivered on his promises to conservatives, particularly social conservatives. I don't know how that will work out in the long run, because I don't know that the jurists are going to use an ideological thrust in order to decide all the decisions that people are hoping they will. And on the other hand, the liberals are really upset because the 30% that are on the left are furious because the court's got 6 justices appointed by Republican presidents, 3 appointed by Democrats. And the assumption being is that these jurists are always ideological. And that we have pushed the courts to being more ideological decision-making bodies over time. And I said to someone about the Barrett confirmation, I mean, one of the things I'll say for Barrett is that she's very, very bright. She's probably the intellectual heir to Antonin Scalia, who was incredibly bright. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was also incredibly bright. And we probably got our best jurisprudence bringing those 2 people, Scalia and Ginsburg, to look at an issue and to write about it. The good news is, for most or a good bit of their time, their colleagues were oftentimes pragmatists who had to judge another factor in understanding. We look at the Constitution, we look at the words in the Constitution, we try to understand their meaning. All of them do that. All of them analyze and look, and they're all quite bright. We also have to look at what the society will tolerate. The Supreme Court has made some rulings in the past that were dramatic and had major consequences on life. Brown versus Board of Education, probably the most significant decision the Supreme Court has ever issued. A number of my conservative friends would argue Roe versus Wade is an equally as important decision that transformed American life. What I would say about Brown versus Board of Education was that Earl Warren understood that it had to be a unanimous verdict. That meant that he had to get everybody on board with it. Even Hugo Black from Alabama, who had started his career as a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And Warren figured out a way to do that because he understood the magnitude of the decision. Even with a 6-3 majority, it's going to be very hard to have radically divergent decisions from what society will tolerate. The abortion issue is a perfect example. And you can look at public opinion polling, and it's been very consistent for years and years and years. About a third of our population adamantly opposes abortion under any circumstance. And they are passionate about that issue. Another third of our population thinks that abortion should be accessible. And another third of the population has mixed feelings. And both sides like to say, and I've watched them do this in plenty of fundraising appeals and other things, say a majority of Americans support the legality of abortion. And that is true.
I think back in 2016, that one position that was vacant was really more important in that campaign than maybe these 3 that have been filled. Did you think that way?
I think that in 2016, this is what animated social conservatives to come out and vote for President Trump. And he has delivered from their perspective. And whether or not that satisfies them, there's kind of 2 schools of thought at the moment, is really up for grabs. One school of thought suggests that social conservatives, most of whom are pretty religious, are going to say, okay, I never liked the other crass and disrespectful side to the president, but it was important to get the people on the court that we needed to get on the court. Now that that's been done, maybe that style isn't appropriate for the president of the United States. And there's a school of thought that says that
don't need him anymore.
Right. that at the very least, they're not going to be as enthusiastic and as animated to go vote for him because he is a candidate that doesn't naturally go hand in glove with thinking about Christian conservatives. I mean, he doesn't go that way. So he doesn't fit as much in that mindset, although he delivered on the promises he made. Now, the other side says he brought what he said he'd bring, and now he needs you to get his back, and will people line up to do that? And it's an interesting question, and we'll have to wait to see what happens in the election.
Let's kind of wrap up the election of the president right now. How do you think that's going to go with what you know and your antenna out there?
My sense of the election is that in the probability cone, this is sometimes what we talk about in statistics, what's likely to happen. Anything's possible. Joe Biden could win 538 electoral votes on election night. Donald Trump could win 538 electoral votes. Those are possible outcomes. They're not probable. The cone of probability suggests that the Electoral College, when all is said and done, is going to be somewhere between a Trump number that looks from about 280 down to about 100.
And he needs how many?
Needs 270.
270.
And so he doesn't have a whole lot of expansion room to go up, but that there are several pathways that get him to 270. 280, 285, somewhere in there is kind of his ceiling. Joe Biden's ceiling is much higher. I mean, there are estimates and there are models that would show him capable of getting 400 electoral college votes, winning all but 135. Now, that model would include him winning in places like Mississippi or Kansas. That's highly unlikely.
Yeah.
But if there's a wave election this time, it looks like it would probably be on the Democrat side. That seems to be fading some. And as expectations go down, the likelihood, based on all that we know, on the imperfect information we have, is that Biden wins somewhere in the range that Barack Obama had won in 2008 in terms of electoral college votes, and probably not quite as many popular votes as he'd won in 2008. That's what it looks like. That doesn't mean that's what will happen.
You're not going to bet the house on it, are you?
I would not bet the house on it. I used to have a crystal ball, and I was more than happy to look in it. And then after 2016, I said, that crystal ball's broke. I ain't going to look at it no more because I'm not getting good results out of it. So it is a hard thing to be able to predict what people are going to do for a variety of reasons.
Okay, let's go to the Georgia Senate races.
That's right. We got the
Loeffler,
yep,
the incumbent,
right.
supposedly.
She's an appointed senator. She has the title. She's never won the seat in an election. She's also never won an election before, which makes her a bit of a different candidate running a statewide. Now, there have been candidates that pulled that off before. We've seen some very credible charges. I mean, her opponent, leading Democratic opponent, is Raphael Warnock, who also has never won an election before. Doug Collins has won a number of elections. He's quite popular amongst his compatriots from the General Assembly, from his years in the General Assembly. I've even heard a number of Democrats speak quite highly of him as a legislator. That is not what we elect usually on. It is usually more about personality, charisma, and stances of ideology. And so he has some challenges there.
Warnock has a good chance, you think?
Well, according to the polling that we see today, Warnock has been the best of the Democrats at coalescing some support. Looks like he's at about 30% at this point, at the expense of Tarver, Lieberman, and all the other people in that race, and there's a lot. But it looks like Warnock has been able to come into the first place contention spot in that race. And Loeffler and Collins look like they're neck and neck, with Loeffler a little bit ahead.
So one or the other, and Warnock will be in a runoff, you think?
That's what it looks like today. Now, the polling that was going on in September and August would have suggested we were going to have a runoff between Loeffler and Collins.
Yeah.
But the Democrats seem to have sent out the word amongst the people in the tribe and said, you're going to have to vote for one candidate, and the one we're saying is Warnock.
Well, I'm kind of I've been in TV all my life, and so I watch it a little more closely, possibly. Warnock comes across very good in his commercials, very good, and it's been cutting through, I think.
Yeah, I would say that I think that the thing with Warnock that he has, and it doesn't show with the two leading Republicans in that race, is that he's different, and I think people have an appetite for something different, and he seems very reasonable and reasoned. And so I think he's running a really good campaign. Now, I understand he doesn't have as much money as some other people have had, but in the runoff, he's not going to have to worry about money. There will be more money coming into the state. And sometimes it just breaks my heart how much money is going to come into the state for electioneering.
That we could use on some really important things.
We got kids that are living in poverty in this
That's
state.
right.
We got teachers that are scraping together to buy school supplies. I'd far rather use that money for them than to do the spectacle of our elections. But
So, like the presidential thing, we Warnock may be in a runoff, and Collins and Loeffler.
I think it's the likelihood is that Loeffler and Warnock go into the runoff
would
at
be
this
the two.
point.
Yeah.
Now Collins could come up, but it looks like Warnock has gotten enough coalescing of the Democratic vote that he's going to be able to get into the first place finish in the first round primary.
Well, basically, Collins and Loeffler will be splitting that Republican vote,
Right.
and he'll get all the others that straight through.
That's right. And I think that one of the things that's interesting about this race is if we go back and look at when the Republicans made their first gains in the South, go back to the 1960s and 70s when the Republicans had breakthrough candidates. They won the House seats. Bo Calloway won the House seat over in Columbus. John Tower won the Senate race in Texas in '61. They did it because the Democrats got fractured and they had nasty, brutal battles.
Yeah.
And people didn't coalesce around the nominee. And I think there is potential. I'm not predicting this. But if Loeffler gets in, what is she going to do to bring the Collins supporters with her? Because if they stay home in a runoff, or they even worse go and decide to vote for Warnock, she's in real trouble.
We got less than 2 minutes.
Okay.
Let's go back to Bibb County again. This sheriff's race. Tell me about that one.
Yeah, I don't know. My best understanding of that one is who's got what signs. And I've seen a lot of Ricketson signs out there that surprised me. This is a Democratic stronghold county. David Davis has been sheriff for at least a couple of terms.
Yeah, 2 terms.
Yeah, and so this is a surprise to me that the challenge seems to be running as strong as it is.
Of course, Rickerson will be riding on possibly the coattails of these other races, too.
Right. But the other thing I would say is that in Bibb County, I don't know that the other races are going to produce big Republican turnout. And so it may not work that way, but he definitely has supporters out there. And you kind of wonder what's going on in the mindset of voters that voted for Lester Miller for mayor, because Lester Miller had a very interesting coalition.
Yes, he did.
From people on the far left to the far right.
That's quite a campaign he put on, wasn't it?
It was. He ran a very solid campaign, and he picked up support in the community from a whole variety of folks, which says to me that here, when we get to really local politics, partisanship isn't really what's going on. Of course, that was a nonpartisan race, but partisanship isn't as much what we're looking for when we start looking at commissioners and sheriffs and school board members.
We'll have to continue this conversation down the road someday, Doctor.
Hope we can do it, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good to have you with us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Middle Georgia Spotlight.
Yep.
Thank you, folks, for joining us on the Middle Georgia Spotlight. I'm Ron Wildman here at WMUB TV.